And we'll ask everyone to go ahead and mute yourself and also turn off your video function. That way we don't have any issues with bandwidth. And then that will be in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. All right, everyone, it's 1 o'clock. And again, if I can have everyone mute if our host can just take a screen and see those that we might need to mute for them. Thanks everyone for joining. This is a follow-up. Well, first I'll introduce myself. This is Catherine Posniak. I lead our fiscal operations and federal support team at the Department of Education. And this is a follow-up to last week's webinar. So last week, we did a webinar on equitable services that was led by our state ombudsman, Daphne Flintroy. I joined you all at the top of that call to give you a short briefing on this issue of equitable services, which has sparked quite the discussion because of some guidance that Ed has provided. I'm going to revisit what I shared with you last week, just in case there are those of you who are on the line today who were not able to join us last week. And then I'm going to talk about how we are going to move forward here. So this is part of a longer deck, and we're not going to cover the material that Daphne covered with you all last week. We are simply today going to talk about the calculation of equitable share. I want to start by saying that there are probably two groups that are most interested in the substance of this webinar today. And that would be one, city and parish school systems. So those of you who have a geographical boundary that you encompass with your school systems. This does not include charter LEAs. So if you're a charter LEA, you're welcome to stay on the line, but this does not apply to you. And then our non-public schools that are within those LEAs. So those are the two audiences that we are addressing today. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, and just make sure we're all clear on what equitable services are. So when we get funding when the U.S. federal government provides allocations or funding according to a formula, for instance, let's take Title I, which takes a look at how many children ages 5 through 17 are living in poverty. When they do that, they are pulling from a census count. And so they're not pulling from your data that you're putting into SIS. We do that at the department once the money comes to us. But when the federal government distributes that money, they're doing that off of the U.S. Census count, which is why that count was very important to take earlier this year. They don't know who is in a public school and who is in a non-public school. And whether a child is in a non-public school, there has been a long-standing agreement that they are still entitled to the funds that were generated entitled to be beneficiaries of the funds that were generated by their count, right? And so that's what equitable services is. It accounts for the kids who were included in that formula count that got baked into the school system count, right? And are eligible to receive those services. I want to be clear that it's in the form of services. It's not public school systems are not writing a check to non-public schools. They are determining what would be the equitable amount and then providing services that add up to the amount. The reason why this doesn't apply to charter LEAs is because when we give them their allocation, that's purely based on the count of kids in at their school, enrolled at their school. There are no other children who are incorporated into that count, unlike the counts that are included for the parish and city school system. So the CARE Act included this equitable services provision, which is pretty standard in federal entitlement grants, and you see that here. So this is the same slide I shared with you last week, and this is a this pulls directly from the CARES Act, Section 18005, which stipulates that any LEA receiving funds from the governor's fund or from the ESSER fund, which was designated specifically for K-12 education, is responsible for providing equitable services. And I highlighted here in the same manner as provided under Section 1117, and that's Title I, Part A of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And I highlighted this here because this ends up being the source of the discussion around equitable services. So the way that this funding that was included in the CARES Act, which was the third relief bill that was passed by Congress, the way that that funding came to the state was via the Title I Part A formula. It's not a Title I Part A program, but they use the same formula as Title I Part A, which again is focused on students from low-income households ages 5 to 17. So if we can go to the next slide. So our expectation, because because this money came to us via Title I Part A, the expectation was that the equitable services calculation would also be similar to what we would typically do in Title I Part A. For those of you all who are deep in this process, that would be the Title I Part Step 4 in Super App, right, where you are determining that share. And so Ed provided guidance on this about a week after that funding was released to us, and that guidance was surprising in that actually it stated that the equitable share calculation would actually be done differently than what we would typically see for Title I Part A. And I'm just going to ask, if you did join us late, if you can make sure that you mute yourself and also turn off your video, and that will be in the lower left-hand part of your screen. And so what Ed said in this guidance, which is linked here if you want to read it for yourself, it provided this guidance in the form of FAQs. And FAQ 7 asked the question, how does an LEA that receives funds under the CARES Act program provide equitable services, quote, in the same manner as provided under Section 1117 of the ESEA? And again, that was taken directly from the federal legislation itself. And what's summarized here in the response below is what Ed said, is that because school systems are not, unlike Title I, which that money is then designated to schools that are running Title I programs. And typically when we would think about the Title I equitable share for non-public school students, the way that we determine that share is whether or not that non-public has children who would otherwise be going to a Title I school if they were going to a public school. So that's how we would determine that share. What Ed said in its guidance, however, was that because the school system was not limited to use its ESSER funds only in Title I schools, it then stood to reason that non-public schools should not be limited to the count of only students who would otherwise attend Title I schools. In other words, what they put here, what here is highlighted, which is to say that the calculation should be based on the number of children enrolled in each non-public school whose students or teachers participate in the CARES Act programs compared to the number of students enrolled in total in public schools in the LEA. Those of you who are familiar with equitable share would realize that actually this guidance and what's highlighted here is more in line with typically how we would calculate Title II or Title IV, which is based on the whole student population of both the non-public school and the public school system. You can turn to the next slide, please. So what does this mean in practical terms? So again, according to this guidance, which again is linked here, the U.S. Department of Education which we call ED because the US DOE is actually the US Department of Energy. So ED's, or the US Department of Education's acronym is ED. What this would mean is first that the proportional share, as I stated before, is calculated by using the total enrollment at both the LEA and the total enrollment at the participating non-public schools. It is not based purely on the number of low-income student counts as would have been previously determined or stated. And again, here it states that this is similar to Title II and Title IV. You know, we have those counts for non-public schools are included. This is a link to the library where we include, because we collect the non-public count data every year. And so that's where you can find that data for all of the non-public schools in your LEA. You can go to the next slide, please. So there was some concern about this discrepancy from, you know, the intention, it seems, of the CARES Act to focus these dollars on low-income students by virtue of the use of the Title I Part A formula, and the direction that ED received. So it's like you receive money from the federal government one way, LEAs received the money from the state, again, according to Title I, but then the equitable share distribution would somehow be separate and would not consider students in poverty at all. And so this has sparked requests for clarification from ED about its guidance. And here, and I believe I shared this last week as well, there's a link here to a letter that the Council of Chief State School Officers sent to Secretary DeVos asking for further clarification of its guidance and a concern that this ran contrary to what was provided for in the CARES Act. Additionally, CCSSO's past president, Pedro Rivera, who is currently the Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania, also wrote a follow-up letter to Assistant Secretary Frank Brogan, who leads the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, asking not only for clarification, but also requesting that ED use the Title I equitable share calculations for FY19 20, as again, many people anticipated that they were going to direct us to do. I will mention that in that letter to the Council of Chief State School, from the Council of Chief State School Officers, they do specifically cite Orleans Parish in there as an example of the difference that this can make. So typically, you know, in Orleans Parish, and you have to remember all of the charter LEAs are taken out of the equation. You know, under Title I, non-public schools would be about 40% in determining the equitable share. If we were going to take a whole student count population, that equitable share would increase to nearly 80%, so nearly twice as much. And 80% of the ESSER allocation that Orleans Parish received. So that's probably the most significant sort of change or difference in the state. Some of you are more, some of your parishes are more affected or would be more impacted by this difference than others, particularly those in more urban areas that have more non-public schools. So if you turn to the next slide, what you see here first, EdWeek actually published, this is a full analysis of the impact for every parish and city school system in Louisiana of what the difference would be. Again, if you were thinking about equitable share in terms of Title I versus equitable share in terms of something comparable to what we would be talking about in Title II. And I want to be clear in all of this, you know, as well, you know, we have a really strong and great non-public school sector in Louisiana, many of which have missions to serve students in need. And so certainly not in any of this is there a sort of a leaning one way or another. I think the source of the concern here is the sort of discrepancy between what is congressional intent and what ED has interpreted that intent to be, and there being a concern that those two things are not the same. And then that creates an issue where, you know, is it that the school district, school system should be following what seems to be apparent in congressional intent, or following the guidance of ED, which actually is non-binding in that. And there are a couple of other articles here on this matter if you wanted to sort of get in the weeds or you weren't as familiar with equitable share. Some of these attempts to explain this in layman's terms, because certainly it can get pretty weedy. And some of the concerns that have been raised by all groups, including non-public schools, about the uncertainty surrounding this interpretation. And in fact, one state earlier this week, Indiana, altogether said that they were going to reject the guidance by the U.S. Department of Education. The issue, though, with that is that equitable services are the responsibility of school systems and not the state. So we could take a position on this at the Louisiana Department of Education, but ultimately the responsibility and the liability of providing equitable services rests with the school systems. And so in talking with a number of superintendent school systems, board members, non-public members, et cetera, really seems like this needed to be a decision that was made at the local level to determine the best course of action, especially, again, since in some cases there isn't that big of a difference between what, you know, following a Title I equitable share calculation versus a Title II equitable share calculation. People can move on and get going on their budgeting. And then in other cases, this is going to be a more significant difference and something that needs to be explored further. So there are a couple of things that, or a couple of ways in which we think that this might be resolved. So I'm going to share those with you and then also talk about what we're going to do most immediately, because it doesn't look like that this is going to be resolved in the next couple of days. Last week when I talked to you, I was hopeful that maybe we would have a resolution within the week. That isn't going to be the case. And in the meantime, you all are held up, right, from moving forward with consultation and also submitting your application. So we wanted to go ahead and move forward here and share with you all what the plan is. So one of the ways in which this could be resolved is that ED could decide to change its guidance or provide clarification, et cetera. And that may happen. They are continuing again to receive letters and concern from many constituents out there who are looking for additional guidance. So that is one way in which this could be resolved. The other way that it could be resolved, and that's here on this slide, is through additional legislation where Congress could further clarify and confirm its intent. So earlier this week, there was actually a fourth relief package introduced in Congress. It was actually introduced in the House. It's called the HEROES Act, and that stands for the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act. It's linked here if you would like to have some light reading. And among the things included in this Act, one is a provision for $90 billion to go to education, 65% of which would go to LEAs by that same Title I formula that was used in the CARES Act. Just to provide you all some context on this, the CARES Act dedicated about $13.5 billion to K-12 education. So this would be approximately just over 4 times that amount. And then it includes an additional $1.5 billion for E-rate to address connectivity issues. Also in here, because of the discussion that was happening around equitable services, it does also include statutory language to further clarify congressional intent in the CARES Act. As it stands right now, actually, this language wasn't completely perfect. So the language that's in here actually talks about only providing the equitable services to students that are low income in non-public schools. It doesn't actually clarify the calculation part of it. So there will likely be an amendment to further clarify that. I would also say that, this act does not have the same bipartisan support that we saw with the CARES Act. And so this was introduced by House Democrats. Republican leadership has been more reticent about passing further relief packages or stimulus packages. And so I don't think that we'll see this kind of go through with the same speed that we saw, or, there's even a question of whether it go through at all, as we saw with the CARES Act, which, all up was just a few weeks. So this is, again, this is another way that this could be resolved, but again, not going to be resolved in the immediate while you all are trying to figure out how you can use these funds for expenses both already incurred and those that you're planning for in the near future. So what we're going to do for this, as this slide moves forward, is provide, and sorry for the duplication here of the screen, I must have somehow glitched this the snapshot. How we are going to do this is to actually leave it to school systems to determine how it is that what are the counts that they are going to use for the equitable share calculation. This is unusual for us. Usually, the grants management team, we would automatically factor in these calculations for you in the EGMS calculation. So, for example, if this were in fact going to use the Title I equitable share, we would just auto-populate that from what you determined or already calculated in the 1920 Super App. Or if you were going to do a whole student count like you did with Title II, again, we could just pull from that. Because that decision of how to go about this will potentially vary from district to district, we are simply in here leaving these open-ended as open-ended counts. We are certainly, we will certainly counsel you, and Daphne continues to be available to walk you through the guidance that that Ed has provided in this, but also we understand that again, that guidance is non-binding, and that there may be reasons why a school system chooses not to follow that guidance. So this is a snapshot of how you will see this in EGMS. This will be live. If it's not already live today, it will probably be live tomorrow under the administration tab in the Strong Start application. And you will see here in 1A, you'll put in the public district count. You'll put in 1B, the non-public count of the participating private schools. And then that will calculate the total and therefore the share of the non-public account share. And I'm going to walk through that calculation with you later. I do want to note that the guidance was also very clear that whether a non-public school has participated in equitable share before, that they should be given the opportunity to signal that they wanted to participate in the CARES Act. And I also want to say that there is no debate about whether or not equitable services should be provided, and the obligation exists. So one way or another, equitable share will need to be provided. That responsibility is still there. This is really, again, about the calculation of that equitable share itself. So from this, and again, we're going to walk through this on the following slides, the application will derive a per pupil allocation for those equitable services, and then determine what this will be for each non-public school. So just to walk through this, first, how you even determine what the school system will retain and what needs to be set aside for non-public equitable services. This is how this is an example of how you walk through that, which is to see what the award amount is, and then you would have a total count of public and non-public schools, whether you are taking the whole enrollment count or thinking about that count in terms of the poverty count in each of those. I would just say that you need to apply those to both entities, right? So you can't say, well, in the case of public schools, I'm going to take the count for the whole system, but in the case of non-public schools, I'm only going to count the schools in, in poverty. Also, you can't just make up, well, I want to sort of count all of the kids in, 9th through 12th grade, and I'm going to count them. Again, the reason for the open-endedness isn't because we're leaving it up to each school system's imagination about how equitable share could be calculated or focused. It is because there seems to, again, be a discrepancy between congressional intent in the CARES Act and the guidance that Ed has provided. So you see here the LEA's count in this example is 900 students. The count in the participating non-public school that raised their hand was 100 students. And when you take that 10% times the $1 million award received by the LEA, that means that there are $100,000 that are set aside for services to non-public schools. From there, once you decide and figure out that calculation, and EGMS will walk through all of those things, if we can flip the slide. And so if you see here from there, then you have to determine what would be the amount for each non-public school, right? And so in this, fictional example, we have 2 non-public schools, one that has 25 students and one that has 10 students. There were other public schools, because all up there were 100 in that total count, but here's an example of the first 2. So you, again, from the previous slide, there was $100,000 set aside for that equitable share. There were, and actually what I'm realizing is the math on this, sorry, we'll correct this by the time we get posted. What I'm realizing here is that this should say 100 non-public students, sorry, there's a discrepancy here, but if we pretend for a moment that actually our count had been 200 non-public students, it would come out to $500 a student, and then you would use that PPA, that per pupil allocation amount, and multiply that times how many students that a school had. So in this case, if the PPA is $500 and they had 25 students, that total would be $12,500 in services that the school system and the non-public school would have to agree on in terms of what were the services that the school system was providing there. All of this is standard and it's how we would, you all that have worked with us for a long time, you could do this with your eyes closed. There's nothing that has changed about that. You can go to the next slide. And this isn't customized to the Strong Start application because we haven't opened this up there yet. So you won't see Title I and Title II and Title III. You'll see here the GERF fund, the ESSER formula fund, the ESSER incentive fund. And right now only the ESSER formula fund is live. But you would see here, you would be putting in those amounts. In this example, if you can see here, it's a little bit fuzzy on the left-hand side. You see it says private schools, and you would be opening up, in this case, we only have 1 private school listed, but how many ever private schools, you would list each private school by name, and then list the amount of equitable share and fill out all of the documentation and forms that Daphne talked about last week in terms of the consultation process and what are the equitable services that will be provided. Next slide. And actually, can we go back to the slide that has the open-ended boxes on there? This is the end of this section, but I want to, and I see that there are questions coming in, and I will try to get to those in a second. Actually, one more slide forward, please. 2 more. The one with the snapshot on it. There we go. I had a couple, I did a briefing with superintendents this morning to talk with them about this issue, and you know, we had a question that was like, well, could we just use the Title I equitable share that we used for 1920? And yes, that is an option that a district could decide to do, because that, if it felt like that was more in line with the intent of the law. I do want to be clear that that is contrary to ED's guidance, and also is a more conservative number, right? That exists in ED's guidance. So just to play this out, let's say that, you know, a district, you know, did decide to sort of calculate this according to the typical Title I equitable share, and there was a challenge about, you know, whether the district or the school system calculated that correctly. The entity that would hear that appeal would be the U.S. Department of Education. That is who gets to decide in a case like that if there is a challenge about whether or not that equitable share calculation was done correctly. It is hard to imagine that ED's going to deviate, right, from its own guidance. So if it sticks with its guidance, it's likely going to say, nope, that's not actually how you should calculate equitable share. You should calculate it this way using total whole student count. And at that point, it would really be left to go into the courts to decide there. That's obviously a really long road, and not one that I think anyone is going to have to take. Hopefully, one of the other ways in which I discussed earlier that this would get resolved will happen first. But until that happens, a district might want to be thinking about what sort of risk they were taking on. So, you know, is it better to sort of reserve more, or, you know, reserve more according to ED's guidance, even if it's not fully allocated at this time, or you put some of it on hold for a while until there is greater clarity around where this would land. Again, this is a highly unusual situation where I can't even tell you, and I've been deeply in these conversations with people all across the country in the last 2 weeks since this guidance came out, and no one can say with any certainty exactly where this is going to land. I know that that puts you all in an awkward position, particularly, again, when it's necessary for you all to go about this process in order for you to move on this much needed funding. So I think this is all to say, if you haven't already, you really need to be having this conversation. If you're within a school system and you're usually doing these calculations, you need to be having this conversation with your school system leaders about what the school system's approach to this is going to be. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to scroll through, if you can give me a minute, scroll through what questions I have. If you have questions that are specific to your district and your context, please direct those to the Grants Help Desk or Daphne in terms of, you know, the particular configuration of schools or what have you on there. I'm not going to be able to address items that are specific to a particular school system or area, but give me a minute here to capture these questions, and then I'll come back online to answer them. Give me one moment. Okay, so let me just start here. So there's a question about whether private schools will receive incentive funds and whether or not those need to be included in the incentive fund request. The short answer is that equitable share applies to all of the CARES Act funding received by LEAs within the CARES Act, and that includes the governor's funds as well, although the governor has not made any announcements about how he will be using or directing that money. In terms of what that means, that is also, I focused today on the calculation part. The equitable services provision for those other funds was also included in the guidance, and we are seeking further clarity there. At this time, if you are making requests in Strong Start, you should not be factoring in private ask for non-public or private schools in those funds against those priorities. And so the next question is, are all public school students included in the count or only the ones in Title I schools? So this is where we go back to it. It depends on how you are interpreting things, right? And so if you're taking one, the CARES Act does not need to be used only on Title I schools. So that is clear. There is no controversy around that. That is not limited to Title I schools. These funds are not for the Title I program. The formula was just used in that way so that it was based on the number of students in poverty, and that's where the funds would flow to. In terms of, the counts that you use, that is going to be, again, a school system level decision. ED's guidance would say that you're including the count of all public school students and the count of all participating non-public schools. There is a concern that is, again, deviates from that congressional intent, and that in fact it should be, it should go back to those that are the poverty counts in those Title I schools. So that would be a determination that needs to be made at the school system level. We would be happy to talk with you all about that. I know that that's not an easy thing to navigate. And so we would be, if you all need help or need to get on the phone with that, feel free to reach out with Daphne. We'll schedule a time with you all to talk this through. Are we only serving approved schools on the list? Yes, they have to be approved non-public schools. They also have to be nonprofits. We are not including here for-profit schools, and they need to be elementary or secondary schools. And so early childhood centers unto themselves are not included in this. It's elementary and secondary schools. Although if it's an elementary school and it has preschool students, those preschool students are going to be included in the count, right? Or preschool students can be in the count if they were attending an elementary or secondary school. There's a question about, is the calculation feature available in the grant now? If it's not available today, it will be tomorrow, so it will be this week. We will be posting this deck in the Strong Start library. So I think there may be already one there from last week. This just fills out the rest of that deck, so we'll make sure that we will get that up there for you all. Again, for those of you who were not here at the beginning of the call, the relevant parties to this discussion are public and city school systems. And so if I could take a map and you all are bound by geography, right, then you are responsible for equitable share. If you are a standalone charter LEA, this equitable share conversation does not apply to you, because the only children that are included in your allocations or in your count are those that are actually enrolled at your school. Let me just take a minute there are more questions that have come in. Let me just take a minute to scan these and see what I can address here. there are some questions about indirect costs, and those indirect cost calculations are done in the same way that they are done for they're done in the same way that they are for Super App, and so it'll be sort of a familiar setup for you all to see there. There are some questions about administrative charges. So those are the costs of administering those grants. We have a clarifying question in to understand the extent to which that would happen. If, as you would though in other budgets, that would be budgeted as its own line within the application, and there are non-public codes, non-public EICs included in that application. Give me one more minute here to take a scan at some of these questions I think I already addressed in earlier ones. There's a question here, if a non-public school didn't participate in equitable services in the fall, will they be able to do so now? Yes. It is going to be the responsibility of the school system to reach out to all eligible non-public schools, whether they have participated in equitable services previously. So there seems to be a little bit of confusion around what these funds are used for. So there's a question here. I thought that these funds were only for K-12 and only those counts would be considered. Are you now saying to include pre-K in the counts? So again, what matters here, if these funds are directed toward elementary and secondary schools. This is the same way that it works for Title I, right? And so even though there's one way in which the count is generated, those funds can still be used for preschool activities and to support preschool that is happening at an elementary school. What you can't have here is an early childhood center that is not, does not actually qualify as an elementary school. But if it is an elementary school and you are including all of the kids in that count, you would include all of the kids at that school, including those that would be in pre-K. And I think some of these that I'm looking at left, again, I think that we have looking here. One other question, this is just general to the grant, is asking about the indirect cost rate. This has been loaded for all LEAs. There is not a supplement, not supplant provision for these funds. So that's why you all are seeing a slightly different indirect cost rate, because it's going to use an unrestricted rate versus a restricted rate in this grant. So I have a question here in terms of, as a non-public school, are we at the mercy of what the public district decides to do with the count and with the funds? So again, I want to be clear, what's not in question is whether equitable services need to be provided. It is about how the calculation should be done. And I don't think that there aren't really any winners or losers in this right now. There's uncertainty on both sides, because there's a risk that either too little is reserved and, a district could, then overspend if it came out actually it's going to be upheld that a whole student count is going to be the way that equitable share is determined, or the other way in terms of you lean toward ED's guidance and that's overturned. And that, you had schools that were planning on these services that actually don't come into fruition. And so again, you know, in talking with districts about this really needs to be examined from at a local level. There are going to be partners that have, you know, non-public schools that are serving a high population of students in poverty, and you're going to know any which way this goes, right? There are going to be equitable services that need to be provided, and that can be the starting point for figuring out what are the equitable services that you all can begin with, knowing that that may dial up or dial down as this guidance is clarified in the future. So I do think, again, you know, what are the sort of the measures that can be put in place that mitigate the risk of, I think, or provide some flexibility given changes that may come in the future. I cannot predict for you, unfortunately, what precisely those changes will be. All right, with that, I think that captured most of the questions. If you all had anything else or specific to your district, again, please reach out to the LDOE.grant help desk at LaGov. And if you have something specific for Daphne, our ombudsman, you can send it there or directly to daphne.flintroy at LaGov. And we will make sure to get back to you. We appreciate your patience as we are trying to sort out a number of questions that you all have that we don't have answers to, but we will try to keep you as informed as we can as we go through this process. Like I said, if it doesn't go live today, we will have this equitable share calculation, the non-public section, open for you all tomorrow to begin to do that work. In the deck that Daphne provided last week were links to all of the documentation that you all will need to get sorted. So even before you do the calculation, you definitely know already that you're going to have to reach out to all of the non-publics in your LEA to determine whether or not they want to participate. And please also make sure that you're scheduling conversations if you're in a school system with your school system leadership to talk about your approach to this equitable share calculation. I appreciate your time today. And again, as we learn more information, we will be sure to share that with you. Thank you.